GitHub Codespaces allows you to code your application virtually from anywhere and decouples your host computer's resources from your application needs. Combined with GitHub Actions and a pass like Vercel, you get a pretty sweet end-to-end application development environment. Codespaces uses a special version of VS Code that runs in the browser, using Azure instances for the backend and a custom Docker configuration. At the present time, Codespaces is on beta and can only be accessed by paying customers. I pay $4 a month for a private account, which I think is a good investment for Codespaces. But I hope GitHub will allow anyone to be able to use them in the future, even if it's on a limited basis. If you have a paid plan, you can access Codespaces on the green code button on your repository. I have a Flask Postgres boilerplate application that I will use as an example that you can go ahead and fork. Press the Code button and select the Codespaces tab. Then hit the New Codespaces button. After a few moments, you should see the VS Code editor loaded. Before continuing, I recommend that you create a new branch where you can encapsulate the files we'll be working on. Codespaces stores all the development environment metadata on a .devcontainer folder. Within that folder, we will have a Docker file, a Docker Compose file, and a special devcontainer.json file that will store the online VS Code preferences. We can kickstart the creation of these files by grabbing a pre-built template with some common settings. So open the VS Code command palette by opening the View command palette and then start typing dev container. Select Codespaces: add development container configuration files. Then select from a predefined container configuration definition. Select Python 3 and PostgreSQL. Select version 3 bullseye, and then click the default on the Node.js prompt, and select Just OK on the additional options. Codespaces will recommend a container rebuild. After that is complete, you will see the new .devcontainer folder. As I mentioned earlier, the devcontainer.json has all the VS Code configuration for you to work comfortably. You can definitely customize this to your liking, and if you've used VS Code before, you'll recognize some of these settings from your own editor. I personally like to work with the black formatter and my PyLinter, as well as PyTest. So I will replace the line 14 right under the Python linting enabled with the following settings. I've also set it up so that whenever I save any Python file, the black formatter will reformat my code. We also want to forward port 5000 so that when we run our application, we can connect from the outside. So uncomment line 40 like so. Save the file. You will see a prompt to rebuild the container, but let's ignore that until we complete the setup. Next, open the Docker file within the dev container folder. We'll add the section to install OS packages, adding the Postgres client, and install Poetry. Save the file, and now let's open the Docker Compose YAML within the dev container folder. The only thing we need to change here is the database credentials to match our settings.py file. So we'll update those three values on line 36. Save the file and let's commit those changes to our branch. Now that the setup of the Codespace is complete, let's rebuild our container. So again, on the command palette, search for Codespaces: rebuild container. At this point, all the changes we worked on are being applied and a new container is being created. Something you should understand is these configuration files only apply to your Codespace container. We can still have, as we have in this repository, a separate Docker file and a Docker Compose YAML file, which won't interact at all with our Codespace. With that cleared up, we're ready to start development. Before anything, we want to have our linting working and be able to start our Flask server. So let's install the Poetry packages. Open a terminal by going to the menu and selecting Terminal, New Terminal, and then enter Poetry install. Now go ahead and open any Python file to check on our Python settings. I'll open the application PY. As you can see, the linting is not really working, and that is because we need to tell VS Code where the Python interpreter is located. Let's check first that Poetry is working correctly. Enter a Poetry shell by doing Poetry shell. You should get no errors, and you should see the virtual environment activated. If you type Flask, you should see the Flask help command. Now open the application PY. You should see that the linter is still not working, visibly showing squiggly lines under the packages that it can find. So open the command palette once again and search for Python select interpreter. You will see some options there, but none of them are correct. If you hit the reload button, you will see a new option that appears with the label Poetry at the end. That's the one we need. Select it, and in a few seconds you will see the squiggly lines disappear and your packages resolving correctly. So let's get our application running. We need to create the tables of the application, and since we use Flask migrate in this project, just go to the terminal and type poetry run flask db upgrade. Let's connect to the local Postgres instance to check if the tables were indeed created. Just type psql-h localhost postgres-u app user. You can list the databases, connect to the app database, and list the tables. Exit the PostgreSQL shell with \q. Okay, everything looks good. How about we run this application now? Let's do it from the terminal. Just do poetry run flask run. Okay, but there's no local host here. So where do we see the application? Codespaces has a pretty sweet built-in networking system that you can access from the little antenna icon on the bottom of the screen. You will see the application 5000 port and a local URL. Before you preview the link, make sure to enable HTTPS on the port by alt-clicking on the port and selecting Change Port Protocol and then HTTPS. Now if you click on the little globe, you will see our application running in a custom URL. This preview link only works in your current browser and GitHub session. If you want to share this URL with others, you can alt-click on the port and you can set the port visibility as public. This will allow you to share the URL with anyone. You can also run tests and add breakpoints anywhere on your code to diagnose issues. To run the application interactively so that the breakpoints work, select the Run and Debug icon and click on Run Flask on the pull-down select. And like Steve Jobs used to say, there's one more thing, and it's really cool. You can open your Codespace in your local VS Code client. Just look in the command palette for Codespaces: open in VS Code. This will install a small Codespaces plugin locally, but after that, you will be able to edit in your local machine and see the changes in your remote Codespace. All in all, Codespaces is a game changer for developers, and it's still on beta, so I'm sure we'll see lots of improvements in the next weeks and months. Let me know what you think about Codespaces.